He called himself a prophet, a chosen messenger of God. To his followers, Tony Alamo was more than a preacher. He was a savior in a dark world, a man who claimed to hear the divine voice and promised eternal life to anyone who obeyed him. But what lay beneath his holy words was a nightmare of manipulation, greed, and unthinkable abuse. Tony Alamo built an empire of fear disguised as faith, and behind the closed doors of his ministry, he created a world where religion was weaponized to control, exploit, and destroy. Tony Alamo's story began like many cult leaders before him, with charm, conviction, and the perfect pitch for salvation. Born Bernie Lazar Hoffman in Joplin, Missouri, in 1934, Alamo moved to California in the 1960s, chasing fame as a pop singer. When that failed, he reinvented himself as a man of God, claiming that Jesus had appeared to him and called him to spread his word. It was during this rebirth that he met Susan Lipowitz, a woman as ambitious and controlling as he was. Together, they founded the Tony and Susan Alamo Christian Foundation in 1969, headquartered in Hollywood. What began as a small street ministry for runaways and addicts quickly grew into something far more sinister. The Alamos promised spiritual freedom but demanded absolute obedience. Their followers were told to sever ties with their families, surrender their possessions, and dedicate their lives to the church. Those who questioned them were shamed, beaten, or excommunicated. By the mid-1970s, the foundation had relocated to Dyer, Arkansas, where it blossomed into a self-contained community. The Alamos preached daily, broadcast sermons, and ran businesses ranging from construction to clothing manufacturing, all using unpaid labor from their followers. The money poured in, and Tony's control deepened. When Susan died in 1982, something in Tony snapped. He declared that she would be resurrected and ordered followers to pray over her corpse for 6 months, refusing to bury her until the stench became unbearable. He began referring to himself as both prophet and God, claiming Susan spoke to him from heaven. He used fear and scripture to justify every cruelty. Women were told to submit, children were told to obey without question, and anyone who doubted was labeled possessed by demons. Over the next 2 decades, Tony Alamo's ministry evolved into a cult-like compound governed by violence and paranoia. Former followers later described beatings with wooden boards, starvation punishments, and forced labor. Children worked long hours in church businesses, were pulled from school, and taught that the outside world was evil. Alamo's sermons became more apocalyptic and erratic, filled with rants against Catholics, Jews, and the U.S. government. He claimed to be preparing for the end times, building what he called God's kingdom on earth. But behind this divine facade, he was living in depravity, taking underage girls as his spiritual wives. In the 1990s, reports began surfacing that Alamo was forcing young girls, some as young as 9, into marriages with him. He justified it by citing biblical patriarchs who had many wives. Survivors later revealed that he would hold mock wedding ceremonies, declaring the girls his brides and subjecting them to sexual abuse. Parents who resisted were punished, sometimes beaten in front of their children. Federal authorities began investigating, but Alamo was adept at evasion. In 1994, he was convicted of tax evasion and sentenced to 6 years in prison after being found guilty of hiding millions in church funds. When he was released in 1998, he rebuilt his ministry, smaller but just as dangerous. His compound in Fuq, Arkansas, became the center of renewed allegations of abuse. Former followers who escaped spoke of nightmarish conditions, of children whipped for minor offenses, of forced fasts that lasted days, and of women kept in fear of eternal damnation. In 2008, the FBI raided the compound. What they found confirmed the horrifying rumors: evidence of child sexual abuse, physical punishment, and control so total it bordered on psychological slavery. 6 women came forward, describing how Alamo had taken them as child brides and assaulted them repeatedly. Some were as young as 8 when the abuse began. During his 2009 trial, prosecutors called him a predator who used the Bible as a weapon. The survivors told harrowing stories of manipulation, how Alamo convinced them that sexual acts were holy, and that disobedience would bring God's wrath. One victim testified that he forced her to marry him when she was just 9, taking her on trips where he would rape her in hotel rooms. Another said he told her she was chosen by God and would be cursed if she ever told anyone. The courtroom heard hours of testimony detailing not just sexual, abuse, but decades of terror inflicted under the guise of religion. The jury took less than 2 hours to convict Tony Alamo on 10 counts of transporting minors across state lines for sex. He was sentenced to 175 years in federal prison, effectively a life sentence. The judge called him beyond redemption. Even then, Alamo showed no remorse. In his statement, he railed against the government, claiming he was being persecuted for his faith. To the end, he believed himself untouchable, a prophet above man's law. Tony Alamo died in 2017 in a North Carolina prison at the age of 82. His death closed a chapter in one of the darkest sagas of American evangelical history. But for his victims, the trauma lingers. Many former members still struggle to rebuild their lives after years of indoctrination and abuse. Some remain estranged from family members who are still loyal to Alamo's teachings. Even after his death, remnants of his ministry continued online, spreading his sermons and insisting he was framed by the government. What makes Tony Alamo's story especially chilling is how he turned faith, something meant to heal and uplift, into a tool for domination. He convinced parents to surrender their children, turned prayer into punishment, and built wealth on the backs of those he enslaved spiritually and physically. His followers believed they were serving God. In truth, they were serving a man who saw himself as one. Alamo's legacy is not one of faith, but of fear, a cautionary reminder that charisma without conscience becomes tyranny. He wore religion like armor, using it to deflect every accusation, manipulate every heart, and justify every sin. And yet, for decades, the world looked away, blinded by his rhetoric, comforted by the illusion that a man who preached the Bible could not possibly be evil. But evil often hides behind the holiest masks, and Tony Alamo's was one that promised salvation, but delivered hell instead. In the heart of Arlington, Texas, a man named Terry Hornbuckle rose to prominence, appearing at first to be the embodiment of spiritual guidance. Hornbuckle was the pastor of Agape Christian Fellowship, a church that grew steadily under his leadership. Charismatic, articulate, and devoted, he quickly earned the trust of his congregation. People looked to him for guidance, confession, and comfort. They believed in his message, in his vision, and in the man who stood before them as a messenger of God. Yet, beneath the sermons and the prayers, a horrifying secret festered, a reality so dark that it would shake the community to its core and leave an indelible scar on those he had promised to guide. Hornbuckle's life had always carried the veneer of respectability. He was educated, having attended seminary, and had shown a keen ability to connect with people on an emotional level. He preached forgiveness, love, and the transformative power of faith. His congregation grew in size and in devotion, trusting him not just as a leader, but as a father figure, a moral compass, and a spiritual protector. They brought their children to church, confided in him their deepest secrets, and believed that he would guard them against harm. They never imagined that the very man who promised safety would be the architect of their suffering. The first hints of trouble began subtly. A few members noticed Hornbuckle exhibiting inappropriate attention toward women in the congregation. Compliments lingered too long, gestures felt intimate, and private conversations seemed to carry unspoken weight. Initially, these observations were brushed aside, rationalized by the community as enthusiasm, mentorship, or overzealous affection. After all, who would suspect a pastor of something so sinister? Who would believe that a man of God could betray the sacred trust placed in him? The crimes themselves were methodical, manipulative, and chilling. Hornbuckle targeted women who sought guidance, counseling, or comfort. Using his position of authority, he coerced them into situations where consent was impossible. He exploited the power dynamic inherent in their relationships, knowing that the women would be hesitant to question a spiritual leader. He drugged some of his victims, manipulating them further and leaving them vulnerable. His actions were not random. They were calculated, deliberate, and rooted in a deep understanding of the trust placed in him by his congregation. The first woman to come forward described a sense of betrayal that is difficult to articulate. She had entered the church, seeking solace during a period of personal crisis. Hornbuckle had presented himself as a mentor, a protector, someone who would guide her through darkness. Over time, he manipulated her trust, convincing her that submission was part of spiritual obedience. The assault itself was sudden, shocking, and violent in its own psychological way, leaving the victim traumatized, confused, and terrified. She questioned herself, her faith, and the man she had believed to be a source of divine wisdom. This was not an isolated incident. Hornbuckle's abuse extended to multiple women over the course of years. Each instance followed a similar pattern: grooming, manipulation, coercion, and assault. He leveraged his role as a pastor to create an environment where victims felt complicit, guilty, or trapped. His sermons, messages, and personal attention were all tools to maintain control. For the women, leaving the situation or speaking out seemed impossible. Fear of ostracism, shame, and disbelief paralyzed them. The very community they had trusted was the arena in which they were violated. Eventually, the pattern could no longer be hidden. One brave woman came forward, and her courage began to unravel Hornbuckle's carefully constructed facade. Investigators began to piece together a timeline of abuse, corroborating accounts from multiple victims. They discovered evidence of drugging, coercion, and repeated assaults. The legal case built slowly but inexorably, each testimony adding weight to the horrifying reality of Hornbuckle's actions. It became clear that the pastor who had preached sermons of love and redemption was, in fact, a predator who weaponized faith against those who trusted him most. The trial was a spectacle of both horror and disbelief. Congregants, families, and the wider community struggled to reconcile the image of the man they had revered with the crimes he was accused of committing. Hornbuckle's defense attempted to undermine the victims, portraying them as misguided or misremembering events. Yet, the weight of evidence, medical, testimonial, and circumstantial, painted an undeniable picture of a man who had systematically abused his spiritual authority for personal gratification. Throughout the proceedings, the emotional toll on the victims was immense. Each testimony required reliving trauma, confronting a figure who had once been a trusted guide, and facing public scrutiny. Many of the women described feeling trapped between their faith and the betrayal they had endured. They spoke of sleepless nights, panic attacks, and the long journey toward reclaiming a sense of safety. The psychological ramifications of Hornbuckle's crimes extended far beyond the immediate acts of abuse, leaving scars that would persist for decades. The community was also profoundly affected. Members of the congregation who had admired Hornbuckle were forced to confront a painful reality. The leader they had trusted was a criminal. Some felt betrayed on a personal level, struggling to understand how someone could mask such evil behind a veneer of righteousness. Others left the church entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with the man who had so thoroughly violated their trust. Religious institutions across the region watched the case closely, fearing that similar abuses could be occurring in silence elsewhere. Ultimately, Hornbuckle was convicted of multiple counts of sexual assault. The sentence reflected not only the severity of the crimes, but also the profound breach of trust involved. Declared a sexually violent predator, he was ordered to serve his time in prison and committed to psychiatric evaluation and care. Given the high likelihood of the legal system had imposed its judgment, but the emotional and spiritual consequences extended far beyond the courtroom. Even after his incarceration, the shadow of Hornbuckle's actions lingered. Survivors struggled with their faith, many questioning not only their past decisions, but the nature of trust itself. Families wrestled with guilt and anger, grappling with how such a man could thrive within a spiritual community. Church members faced the daunting task of rebuilding a sense of security and integrity in their religious practice, while others left organized faith entirely, disillusioned by the betrayal they had endured. Hornbuckle's story also raises difficult questions about the intersection of faith and authority. How can congregants protect themselves from those who exploit spiritual trust? How can institutions ensure accountability without undermining genuine spiritual guidance? And perhaps most unsettling, how many others might be suffering in silence, victims of the very people who promised to shepherd their souls? The legacy of Terry Hornbuckle is, therefore, not limited to his crimes. It is also the long-term trauma experienced by survivors, the shattered trust within his community, and the cautionary tale it serves for all who place faith in figures of power without scrutiny. The case reminds us that the veneer of holiness can hide horrific intentions, and that vigilance, awareness, and courage are sometimes necessary to protect the vulnerable. Ultimately, the story leaves a haunting reflection. When a pastor betrays the very people who confided in him, when the spiritual leader becomes a predator, the consequences ripple far beyond individual victims. Families are broken, communities are shaken, and faith itself is tested. And for the survivors, the path to healing is long, complicated, and often filled with doubt, yet it is also a testament to resilience. courage, and the enduring human capacity to seek justice, even in the face of unimaginable betrayal. In the quiet, snow-covered landscapes of Sweden, in the small town where faith and community intertwined, a man named Helge Fossmo rose as a seemingly devoted pastor. Fossmo's charisma was undeniable. He was eloquent, commanding, and deeply respected by his congregation. People believed in his guidance, confided their fears and doubts, and turned to him for solace during the harsh Scandinavian winters. To outsiders, he was a model of piety and leadership. Yet beneath his calm demeanor, a storm of manipulation, control, and murder was quietly gathering strength, a storm that would leave the town forever altered. Fossmo's rise in the church was marked by careful cultivation of trust. He married Helene Fossmo, a woman who adored him and supported his work in the congregation. Together, they were seen as the perfect pastoral couple, embodying faith, love, and commitment. Helge, in particular, had a gift for inspiring loyalty. His sermons blended scripture with personal anecdote, drawing members in with the promise of personal transformation and divine favor. Yet those closest to him began to sense an undercurrent of darkness, subtle manipulations, emotional pressure, and a growing need for control that seemed out of place in a religious leader. In 1999, tragedy struck. Helene Fossmo was found dead in their bathtub, her body showing signs that hinted at more than a simple accident. The investigation revealed that she had been poisoned with a lethal dose of medication, and her death bore the marks of premeditation. The community was shocked. The pastor they had revered as a man of God, a moral compass in uncertain times, now stood at the center of a chilling murder investigation. How could the man who preached love and salvation be implicated in the death of his own wife? As the investigation unfolded, shocking layers of manipulation and criminal activity came to light. Fossmo had become involved with Sarah Svensson, a younger woman in the congregation, and their relationship had evolved into a disturbing blend of sexual obsession and spiritual coercion. Using his authority as a pastor, Fossmo sent anonymous, prophetic messages to Svensson, instructing her to act according to what he framed as divine will. The line between faith and manipulation blurred, as she came to believe that following his instructions was not only righteous but mandated by God himself. These instructions escalated into violence. Under Fossmo's direction, Sarah attacked his wife with a hammer, an act that left the town in disbelief and horror. The idea that a pastor could manipulate a member of his congregation to commit such an act defied comprehension. The crime was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was orchestrated, premeditated, and executed under the guise of spiritual obedience. Fossmo's ability to leverage faith, authority, and psychological manipulation made him both a terrifying figure and a masterful predator. The trial that followed was a tense and emotionally charged affair. Victims, witnesses, and community members testified to the web of lies, manipulation, and control that Fossmo had maintained over his congregation. Experts spoke about psychological manipulation, highlighting how his position of authority allowed him to exploit belief and trust. Survivors described the slow, almost imperceptible way he had tightened his control, turning devotion into obedience and loyalty into complicity. Fossmo was ultimately convicted of murder, an accessory to murder. The court recognized not only the severity of his actions, but the profound breach of trust inherent in his crimes. He had weaponized faith, converting spiritual guidance into a tool for manipulation and harm. The legal judgment, while severe, could not erase the emotional devastation left in the wake of his actions. Families were left mourning lost loved ones. Congregants wrestled with feelings of betrayal and guilt, and the town itself struggled to reconcile the image of a spiritual leader with the reality of a calculated criminal. The psychological impact of Fossmo's crimes extended far beyond the immediate victims. Members of the congregation who had admired him were forced to confront the unsettling reality that someone they trusted implicitly could harbor such darkness. Many left the church entirely, grappling with the challenge of rebuilding their faith in the aftermath of betrayal. Others remained, seeking solace in the institution itself, while wrestling privately with disillusionment and shock. Helge's case remains a stark reminder of the dangers of absolute trust. He exemplifies how authority, when combined with charisma and manipulation, can be used to devastating effect. The power dynamics within religious communities, where leaders are often seen as beyond reproach, can allow abuse to persist for years, sometimes unnoticed, until it culminates in tragedy. Fossmo's crimes revealed the fragility of trust and the devastating consequences when it is violated. Even years after the conviction, questions linger. How many other members of the congregation were manipulated in subtle ways? Their obedience, extracted through fear, loyalty, or the belief in divine instruction. How many people's lives were quietly harmed, their voices never heard, their suffering unacknowledged? Fossmo's legacy is one of terror disguised as faith, leaving behind a trail of trauma that extends far beyond the immediate acts of murder and manipulation. The aftermath of Fossmo's crimes reshaped the community. Counseling and psychological support became necessary for survivors, while churches in the region began reviewing their oversight and accountability measures. The case highlighted systemic vulnerabilities in religious institutions, showing how power can be abused when checks and balances are weak or absent. Survivors spoke about the long-term emotional impact, fear, shame, and distrust, and the arduous journey toward healing. Fossmo himself became a symbol of duality, the outwardly devoted pastor and the hidden manipulator. His ability to maintain a facade of righteousness while orchestrating acts of violence illustrates a chilling mastery of deception. He was able to convince those around him that his instructions were divine, exploiting both faith and fear to achieve his ends. The complexity of his manipulation demonstrates that true crime can extend far beyond physical acts, encompassing psychological domination and exploitation of belief. The story of Helge Fossmo ultimately leaves a haunting question. How can a community recover when its spiritual guide betrays them in such a profound way? When someone entrusted with moral and spiritual authority uses it to orchestrate murder and psychological terror, the consequences ripple through time. Trust, once broken, is not easily restored, and faith itself can be called into question for those who were victimized. In reflecting on Fossmo's crimes, one cannot ignore the human cost. Beyond the legal proceedings and convictions lies the pain of individuals who were manipulated, coerced, and terrified. The town he once guided remains haunted by the knowledge that evil can wear the guise of holiness, and that those we trust most are not always who they appear to be. Families lost loved ones, congregants lost their sense of safety, and a town lost its innocence. Helge Fossmo's story stands as a cautionary tale. The abuse of power in the name of faith can be catastrophic. It shows that charisma and authority, when wielded without accountability, can lead to acts of unimaginable cruelty. It reminds communities everywhere to remain vigilant, to question leaders, and to ensure that faith is never exploited to harm those who are most vulnerable. The darkness Fossmo brought into a quiet Swedish town may have been contained legally, but its psychological and emotional shadows linger, a chilling testament to the dangers hidden behind a facade of devotion. In the bustling city of Seoul, South Korea, a man named Jaerock commanded attention, authority, and devotion. He was the founder of Manmin Central Church, a congregation that quickly grew into one of the largest in the nation. Charismatic, eloquent, and visionary, Lee presented himself as a prophet, a spiritual guide with the ability to heal, foresee the future, and lead his followers toward divine favor. To his congregants, he was the embodiment of faith, a man whose words could inspire, uplift, and even transform lives. Yet beneath the surface of devotion lay a darkness that would shock the nation and stain the lives of countless believers. Lee's rise was marked by relentless energy and ambitious expansion. He published books, led large-scale services, and cultivated a global following. His sermons were not just religious teachings, they were performances carefully crafted to inspire awe and obedience. He promised miracles, healings, and personal revelations, drawing people in with the allure of direct contact with the divine. For many, attending his services became a ritual, a lifeline, and an act of complete faith. Families invested their trust, time, and resources, believing that Lee was a conduit for God's blessings. However, the devotion of his followers also created an environment where boundaries could be crossed with impunity. Lee's authority was absolute. Questioning him was framed as questioning God. In this context, he began to exploit women within his congregation. Victims reported that Lee coerced and manipulated them into sexual acts under the guise of divine instruction. He framed submission as a spiritual requirement, convincing women that resisting him would bring misfortune upon themselves or their families. The psychological manipulation was as devastating as the physical acts themselves, leaving victims confused, isolated, and ashamed. The crimes went on for years, carefully hidden beneath layers of religious fervor and institutional power. Women who tried to resist or speak out were often met with threats, intimidation, or subtle forms of shaming. Within the church, the veneer of holiness shielded Lee from scrutiny. Members believed in his miracles and prophecies, creating a powerful mechanism of denial that allowed the abuse to continue unchecked. Many victims internalized guilt, believing they had failed in faith or moral responsibility. Eventually, the pattern of abuse could no longer be concealed. Multiple victims came forward, recounting remarkably similar experiences of coercion, intimidation, and assault. Their courage forced the legal system to take action. The trial revealed a man who had used his religious authority to manipulate and harm, betraying the most fundamental trust placed in him. Lee's charisma, once a tool for spiritual inspiration, had become a weapon of control. The court convicted him on multiple counts of sexual assault and rape, recognizing both the severity and systematic nature of his crimes. He was sentenced to 15 years in prison and prohibited from working with minors for a decade. The legal outcome was clear and decisive, yet it could not erase the trauma endured by the victims. Their faith, personal security, and sense of self had been irreparably damaged by the very man who had promised guidance, protection, and divine favor. The reaction of the congregation was a mixture of shock, disbelief, and disillusionment. Many followers struggled to reconcile the image of the man they had worshipped with the reality of his actions. Some abandoned their faith entirely, unable to reconcile spiritual devotion with betrayal on such a profound scale. Others rationalized his behavior, attempting to preserve the sanctity of the institution or the teachings that had inspired them. Families were torn apart, communities destabilized, and the scandal became a national conversation about the vulnerability of faith when wielded by those with unchecked power. Beyond the immediate victims and congregation, the legacy of Jaerock Lee raised broader questions about religious authority, accountability, and the structures that enable abuse. How could someone with such influence exploit faith to commit repeated acts of violence? How many others may have suffered in silence, their voices silenced by fear or devotion? And, perhaps most unsettling, how does a community recover when the very figure entrusted with spiritual guidance is revealed as a predator? Even after his imprisonment, Lee's case left unanswered questions. The church he built continued to operate, albeit with diminished authority and credibility. Some followers maintained their loyalty, interpreting his conviction as persecution or misunderstanding. Others struggled to rebuild their lives, their faith shaken, their trust in spiritual leadership permanently altered. Lee's crimes were a stark reminder that the allure of charisma and the promise of divine insight could mask manipulation, coercion, and abuse. The story of Jaerock Lee is not merely one of criminality. It is a narrative of betrayal, manipulation, and the fragility of human trust. It demonstrates how authority, when unchallenged, can be weaponized to devastating effect. It underscores the vulnerability of communities that place absolute faith in their leaders without oversight or accountability. And most of all, it reveals the profound human cost of such betrayal, the shattered confidence, the psychological scars, and the enduring struggle to reclaim autonomy and faith in the aftermath of abuse. For the women victimized, the journey to healing is long and fraught. Many confront lingering guilt, anxiety, and fear. Even years after the legal resolution, the emotional scars left by the abuse are compounded by the betrayal of a man who wielded faith as both a shield and a sword. Communities continue to grapple with the implications of the crimes, recognizing that trust, once violated at this scale, is not easily restored. Jaerock Lee's story serves as a chilling case study in the abuse of religious power. It demonstrates that charisma, when unaccountable, can facilitate crimes hidden behind piety and devotion. It is a cautionary tale for individuals and institutions alike, emphasizing the need for vigilance, transparency, and the protection of the vulnerable. Faith can inspire and uplift, but when exploited, it can become a tool for manipulation, control, and profound harm. In reflecting on this story, one cannot ignore the haunting question it leaves behind. How can communities balance faith with accountability? How do individuals protect themselves when those entrusted with moral and spiritual guidance betray them in the most intimate and damaging ways? And, perhaps most unsettling, how many other charismatic figures, revered as conduits of divine will, may harbor hidden predatory intentions, waiting for the opportunity to exploit the devotion of the faithful? The case of Jaerock reminds us that behind the facade of holiness, human flaws and in some cases, criminal intent may lurk. It challenges us to question the structures of power within religious institutions and to advocate for accountability, transparency, and safeguards that protect the vulnerable. Ultimately, it is a story that demonstrates the profound consequences of misplaced trust, the enduring impact of betrayal, and the resilience required to confront and heal from the darkest chapters of human deception. Which of these cases shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments. In the city of Boston, Massachusetts, during the 1970s and 1980s, Paul Shanley rose as a prominent figure in the Catholic Church, to parishioners and the community at large. Shanley appeared to be a progressive, compassionate, and caring priest, dedicated to helping children and families. His sermons were filled with messages of love, understanding, and outreach, and he was often assigned to parishes where he could work closely with youth. The public face of Shanley was one of benevolence and moral guidance, yet beneath this facade lurked a series of actions that would shock the nation and leave lasting scars on countless lives. Shanley's influence within the church was significant. He was known for his work with troubled youth, counseling families, and advocating for what he described as a more compassionate approach to faith. His colleagues praised his dedication, and parents trusted him implicitly. Children were drawn to his energy, charisma, and attention, seeing him as a mentor and protector. But what appeared to be guidance was, for many, the beginning of a nightmare. Shanley preyed on the very children he was meant to safeguard, exploiting his authority and position within the church. The first reports of misconduct were subtle, dismissed as misunderstandings or exaggerated claims. Over time, however, patterns emerged. Victims began to speak of inappropriate touching, manipulation, and coercion, often occurring under the guise of counseling sessions or private meetings. Shanley's methods were insidious. He cultivated trust, isolated his victims from protective influences, and framed his actions as expressions of care or spiritual necessity. The betrayal was profound. The children confided in a man they believed was their guide and protector, only to be exploited by him. As the years progressed, allegations against Shanley multiplied. Survivors recounted abuse that was both systematic and horrifying in its frequency. He moved between parishes, a pattern that allowed him to evade scrutiny and continue his predatory behavior. Families who trusted the church were unaware of the danger, and the institution's hierarchy often prioritized reputation over accountability. Reports that could have prevented further harm were ignored, delayed, or dismissed, enabling Shanley to operate with near impunity for decades. The legal battle against Shanley began in earnest only after survivors found the courage to come forward. Often after years of silence, fear, and trauma, his crimes were documented meticulously, corroborated by multiple victims, and supported by evidence of the church's failure to act. When the case finally reached the courts, the sheer scale of the abuse stunned the public. Shanley was convicted of sexual abuse of minors, and the trial revealed a pattern of manipulation, exploitation, and betrayal that went far beyond isolated incidents. Shanley was sentenced to prison, where he remained for years as the legal system sought to hold him accountable. His conviction was a milestone in the broader exposure of systemic abuse within the Catholic Church, highlighting not only the actions of one individual but the institutional failures that allowed him to harm so many. Survivors expressed a mixture of relief and continuing anguish, recognizing that while justice had been served, the emotional and psychological impact of the abuse could not be fully undone. The aftermath of Shanley's crimes rippled through the community and the church. Families struggled with feelings of betrayal and guilt, questioning how a man of faith could commit such heinous acts. Congregants grappled with disillusionment, torn between their belief in the church and the reality of its failures. Survivors faced the long, difficult process of recovery, seeking therapy, support, and understanding to reclaim their lives. The psychological wounds left by Shanley's actions would persist for decades, illustrating the long-term consequences of abuse within positions of trust. Shanley's story is not only a tale of individual criminality, but also a study in systemic failure. The church's lack of accountability allowed him to move freely, harming more children with each reassignment. It serves as a chilling reminder that institutions must prioritize the safety and well-being of the vulnerable over reputation and authority. The tragedy lies not only in Shanley's actions, but in the environment that allowed him to exploit faith, trust, and innocence. Even years after his conviction, the story of Paul Shanley remains haunting. Survivors continue to share their experiences, seeking acknowledgement and justice. Communities reflect on how to safeguard against future abuse, creating oversight mechanisms, education programs, and support networks to prevent predators from exploiting positions of trust. The legacy of Shanley's crimes is a stark illustration of how charisma, authority, and institutional protection can combine to facilitate predatory behavior, and how courage, persistence, and legal action are necessary to confront it. The story of Paul Shanley leaves a chilling question in the minds of all who hear it. How do communities recognize and prevent the exploitation of the vulnerable by those who present themselves as moral and spiritual guides? When trust is weaponized, the consequences are catastrophic, and the path to justice is long and arduous. Survivors' resilience, however, demonstrates the human capacity to reclaim agency and confront darkness, even in the aftermath of betrayal by those they once revered. For those affected, the scars left by Shanley's actions serve as both a warning and a call to vigilance. Faith and devotion, while powerful and transformative, must never be exploited to harm. The legacy of Paul Shanley is a stark testament to the dangers of misplaced trust, the long-lasting impact of abuse, and the necessity of accountability within all institutions that hold power over the vulnerable. In the sun-drenched suburbs of California, a real Edric Cunningham, better known as Pastor Ed Cunningham, became a figure of trust, authority, and spiritual guidance. He was a man whose presence commanded attention, whose sermons resonated with emotional intensity, and whose church drew congregants from across the region. Families trusted him implicitly, believing he could shepherd them through life's challenges with divine wisdom. Yet behind the pulpit and beneath the carefully curated persona lay a pattern of manipulation, abuse, and criminality that would horrify the community. Cunningham's ministry was characterized by passionate sermons, personal counseling sessions, and a hands-on approach to his congregation's lives. He encouraged parishioners to confide in him, to share their deepest fears, doubts, and personal struggles. This intimacy, once framed as pastoral care, became the very mechanism by which he would exert control. Vulnerable members, particularly young women, found themselves at the mercy of a man who exploited their trust for his own gratification. Over time, complaints began to surface, whispered concerns that Cunningham's counseling sessions were crossing boundaries. At first, the community was hesitant to believe them. How could a pastor, a figure of such moral authority, be capable of such violations? Yet the accounts were strikingly consistent. Private sessions that became inappropriate, spiritual guidance twisted into coercion, and a manipulation so subtle and pervasive that victims initially doubted their own perceptions. Cunningham's charisma had allowed him to create an environment in which questioning him seemed impossible, a violation of both faith and trust. The escalation of Cunningham's behavior was chilling. Some women reported sexual advances that turned into assaults, conducted under the guise of spiritual instruction or divine necessity. Others were groomed, their vulnerabilities carefully exploited, their loyalty to him manipulated through promises of protection, attention, or spiritual favor. The abuse was not chaotic but strategic, rooted in Cunningham's understanding of human psychology and faith-based power dynamics. Each victim was chosen with precision, each interaction carefully orchestrated to maintain his control. Eventually, the victims found courage, they came forward, and law enforcement began to investigate the allegations. What emerged was a systematic pattern of abuse, hidden beneath decades of public service and religious guidance. The investigation revealed a man who had weaponized faith, exploiting the devotion of those who trusted him most. His sermons, his reputation, and his pastoral image had masked years of manipulation and sexual abuse, creating a paradox in which the very community that revered him was also his shield. The trial of Ariel Edric Cunningham became a focal point of media attention and community shock. Victims recounted their experiences with harrowing clarity, describing emotional and physical manipulation, coercion, and the betrayal of trust that had defined their interactions with Cunningham. Psychologists and experts testified on the mechanisms of grooming and manipulation, emphasizing how authority, charisma, and faith had been combined to facilitate abuse. The courtroom became a stage on which decades of hidden crimes were finally laid bare. Cunningham was convicted on multiple counts of sexual assault and abuse of authority. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crimes and the breach of trust inherent in exploiting the spiritual and emotional vulnerability of others. Justice, while finally achieved, could not erase the psychological and emotional trauma endured by the victims, whose lives had been profoundly affected by someone they had believed to be a guide and protector. The aftermath of Cunningham's crimes extended far beyond the courtroom. The congregation was left fractured, grappling with disbelief and betrayal. Some members left the church entirely, unable to reconcile their faith with the man they had once trusted. Others remained, attempting to separate the teachings of the faith from the actions of the man who had corrupted them. Families struggled with the implications, wondering how a figure so trusted could have caused such harm, and how to protect themselves from similar abuse in the future. Cunningham's story is emblematic of the dangers of unchecked authority within spiritual communities. It underscores the vulnerability of individuals who place faith in leaders without oversight, and the devastating consequences when that trust is violated. The crimes of a single man reverberated through entire families and communities, highlighting the importance of vigilance, accountability, and mechanisms to prevent abuse. Even years after his conviction, the psychological and emotional scars remain. Survivors continue to process the trauma, seeking therapy, support, and a path toward healing. The legacy of Cunningham's actions serves as a cautionary tale, demonstrating how easily devotion can be exploited and how essential safeguards are in environments where power and trust intersect. The story of a real Edric Cunningham leaves a haunting reflection. When the shepherd becomes the predator, the ripple effects extend far beyond the individual victims. Communities are destabilized, faith is tested, and trust becomes a fragile, contested space. His crimes remind us that vigilance, awareness, and courage are necessary to protect the vulnerable, even within spaces designed to provide safety, guidance, and spiritual comfort. In the bustling city of Seoul, South Korea, David Yonggi Cho emerged as a towering figure in global Christianity. Founder of the Yoido Full Gospel Church, Cho built what would become the largest congregation in the world, attracting millions with his messages of faith, prosperity, and divine blessing. To followers, he was a visionary, a spiritual father, and a living conduit of God's power. But behind the image of devotion, humility, and leadership lay a pattern of deception, manipulation, and financial exploitation that would mar his legacy and leave a trail of disillusionment in his wake. Cho's rise was meteoric. Starting with only a handful of believers in the 1950s, he grew his church into a massive institution with global influence. His sermons combined charismatic energy, promises of personal prosperity, and an unshakable faith in divine provision. Congregants poured their resources, savings, and trust into the church, believing in Cho's guidance and the spiritual rewards he promised. Many claim to have received miracles, healings, or financial blessings through the power of Cho's ministry. Yet what was presented as divine guidance often concealed personal gain and manipulation. In the midst of his expansion, Cho and his son, Cho Hae-jun, were accused of embezzling funds from the church. Over the years, they had diverted tens of millions of dollars, using donations intended for ministry and humanitarian work to finance personal lifestyles, luxury apartments, and business ventures. Investigators uncovered a carefully orchestrated financial system that masked the misuse of funds, presenting the money as necessary for church operations or divine projects. Congregants were none the wiser, their trust exploited in ways they could scarcely imagine. The scandal erupted when internal audits and whistleblowers revealed inconsistencies in the church's finances. Members were shocked to learn that their contributions, often given in faith and devotion, had been used for private enrichment rather than community or charitable work. The legal investigation traced the funds, uncovering complex financial maneuvers designed to shield Cho and his son from accountability. The revelations struck at the heart of the congregation, leaving members feeling betrayed, manipulated, and deceived by a leader they had revered. During the trial, evidence demonstrated not just financial misconduct, but the broader ethical breach inherent in exploiting spiritual authority for personal gain. Cho and his son defended themselves, claiming mismanagement rather than malfeasance, yet the evidence was overwhelming. They were convicted of embezzlement and sentenced to prison. Though Cho's advanced age and the appeals process complicated the enforcement of the sentences. While justice was sought in the courts, the emotional and spiritual damage inflicted upon congregants was immeasurable. Families had lost savings, individuals questioned their faith, and trust in religious institutions was deeply shaken. The aftermath of Cho's crimes reverberated far beyond South Korea. Religious institutions around the world scrutinized their own financial practices, recognizing the potential for abuse when leaders wielded unchecked authority over both spiritual and material resources. Congregants struggled with betrayal, some abandoning faith entirely, while others wrestled with how to reconcile Cho's ministry's successes with the deception at its core. The scandal became a cautionary tale about the intersection of faith, trust, and financial power, highlighting the vulnerability of communities that place absolute trust in spiritual authority without oversight. Cho's story illustrates the subtlety of abuse beyond physical or sexual harm. Here, the crime was of the heart and the pocketbook, a violation of trust that leveraged devotion and belief for personal gain. The scale of the deception, combined with Cho's charisma and global influence, magnified the impact, leaving millions to confront the uncomfortable reality that even spiritual leaders can be deeply flawed, self-serving, and corrupt. Even years after the conviction, the psychological and emotional fallout remains. Congregants who had given their time, money, and faith continued to grapple with disillusionment. Some rebuilt trust slowly, redirecting their devotion to smaller, more accountable ministries. Others remain wary, skeptical of leaders who claim divine authority. Cho's actions serve as a stark reminder that vigilance, transparency, and accountability are essential in any institution where authority intersects with trust. The story of Yonggi Cho leaves a haunting reflection. Devotion without oversight can be weaponized, faith can be exploited, trust betrayed, and communities left fractured by the very person they believed would guide and protect them. His crimes were not violent in the traditional sense, yet the damage was profound, undermining the spiritual and financial security of millions. In the world of religious leadership, charisma and authority, when left unchecked, can become tools for deception, manipulation, and personal gain. Cho's legacy, once defined by global influence and spiritual triumph, is now inseparable from the scandal that exposed the misuse of faith and trust. For congregants and observers alike, his story is a chilling reminder. The most revered leaders are not always what they seem, and vigilance, critical awareness, and accountability are the only safeguards against betrayal at the hands of those we trust the most. In the arid streets of Phoenix, Arizona, a man named Mark A. Gudo became one of the most feared criminals in the region, earning the grim nickname, the Baseline Killer. Unlike many of the cases in this series, Gudo's crimes were not cloaked in religious authority, but his story shares a terrifying common thread: the exploitation of trust and vulnerability. Gudo was known to neighbors and acquaintances as unassuming, sometimes even likable, a man who could blend seamlessly into his environment. But beneath the ordinary exterior lay a calculated predator whose actions would terrorize the community for years. Gudo's life was marked by instability from an early age. He struggled with the law as a youth, faced numerous arrests for minor offenses, and cycled through periods of temporary employment and homelessness. Despite these challenges, he managed to maintain an appearance of normalcy that allowed him to evade suspicion. In his mid-30s, Gudo began a series of violent crimes that would later be classified as one of the most notorious serial murder sprees in Arizona history. From 2005 to 2006, Gudo embarked on a spree of terror that included robbery, sexual assault, and murder. He specifically targeted women in vulnerable positions, often approaching them in familiar neighborhoods, or while they were performing routine tasks, like walking to a bus stop or jogging. His methods were chillingly methodical. He would observe, plan, and execute his attacks with precision, leaving victims and the community paralyzed with fear. Some victims survived, recounting harrowing encounters that revealed the extent of his manipulative and violent behavior. Gudo's victims were primarily women, many of whom trusted their surroundings and believed they were safe in their neighborhoods. He exploited this trust, striking in moments of perceived security and using both physical force and intimidation to control his victims. Each attack followed a pattern designed to minimize detection while maximizing fear, demonstrating a cold and calculated understanding of human behavior and law enforcement procedures. The investigation into the Baseline Killer was extensive and fraught with challenges. For months, Phoenix law enforcement struggled to connect the seemingly random attacks. Witnesses provided fragmented descriptions, forensic evidence was limited, and Gudo's ability to blend into his environment allowed him to evade capture. Yet painstaking detective work eventually identified patterns in the crimes, linking him to multiple assaults and murders. Forensic analysis, combined with witness testimonies, eventually built a case that was irrefutable. When Gudo was finally arrested, the community's sense of relief was tempered by shock. The man who had appeared unremarkable on the surface was revealed to be a serial predator, responsible for at least 9 murders and multiple sexual assaults. The courtroom proceedings were tense, emotional, and exhausting for the survivors, families, and law enforcement personnel who had dedicated countless hours to building the case. Gudo's demeanor during trial alternated between defiance and indifference, further horrifying those who had suffered at his hands. The trial concluded with a guilty verdict on all counts, and Gudo was sentenced to death. The judgment reflected the severity of his crimes, the calculated nature of his attacks, and the irreparable harm inflicted upon victims and the broader community. Families of the deceased were left to grieve, while survivors confronted lifelong trauma, struggling with nightmares, anxiety, and the constant fear that he might have struck again. The psychological impact of Gudo's spree was profound. Residents of Phoenix found themselves questioning their safety, trust in public spaces, and the assumptions they had made about normalcy in their neighborhoods. Communities that had once taken comfort in familiar routines were now forced to confront the reality that evil can exist behind an unassuming face. Schools, local organizations, and neighbors implemented safety measures, awareness campaigns, and community support networks to prevent future tragedies. Gudo's story is a chilling exploration of how predation can exploit trust and perceived security. While he did not wear a mantle of religious authority, his actions demonstrate the universal vulnerability of those who place faith in ordinary appearances. The case illustrates how predators can operate under the radar, using psychological insight, patience, and manipulation to control, harm, and terrify. Even after his incarceration and sentencing, the shadow of the baseline killer lingers. Survivors continue to grapple with the trauma, families continue to mourn, and communities remain vigilant, aware that the memory of terror can shape the collective psyche for decades. Law enforcement agencies use the case as a training example, highlighting the importance of pattern recognition, persistence, and community awareness in capturing and preventing serial offenders. Gudo's story leaves a haunting reflection. Danger is not always visible, and trust, once exploited, can leave permanent scars. The ripple effects of his crimes are felt not only by direct victims but by entire communities forced to confront the fragility of safety and the presence of evil in unexpected places. His case serves as a grim reminder that vigilance, awareness, and timely intervention are essential to protecting the vulnerable from those who hide their true nature behind a mask of normalcy. In the bustling media-driven world of 1980s televangelism, Jim Bakker emerged as one of the most recognizable and influential figures in American religious broadcasting. Founder of the PTL, Praise the Lord Club, Bakker built an empire that blended television, ministry, and entertainment, promising spiritual fulfillment and financial blessing to millions of viewers. He was charismatic, persuasive, and visionary, portraying himself as a man chosen to deliver God's message to a modern audience. Yet behind the bright lights, broadcast studios, and glossy productions lay a story of deception, greed, and exploitation that would culminate in one of the most infamous scandals in the history of American religion. Bakker's rise was rapid. Alongside his wife, Tammy Faye Bakker, he cultivated an image of piety and generosity. The PTL network became a cultural phenomenon, combining preaching, music, and emotional storytelling that drew in viewers across the nation. Donations poured in from loyal followers who believed in the promises of spiritual and material rewards. Bakker's ministry offered hope, healing, and inspiration, and for many, the weekly broadcasts were a lifeline, connecting them to a sense of divine purpose and community. However, the financial foundation of Bakker's empire was unstable and fraught with unethical practices. Donations from congregants and viewers, often given in faith and devotion, were mismanaged, diverted, or outright embezzled to fund personal luxuries, lavish lifestyles, and the maintenance of the media empire. Real estate projects tied to the ministry, including Heritage USA, a Christian-themed amusement park and resort, became vehicles for financial manipulation. With investors and followers unaware of the full extent of the improprieties, the scandal reached a breaking point when reports of sexual misconduct surfaced. Jessica Hahn, a church secretary, accused Bakker of sexual assault, alleging that he had used his position of power to coerce and manipulate her. This revelation, combined with mounting evidence of financial fraud, triggered a media firestorm, exposing the dark underbelly of a ministry that had long appeared virtuous and untouchable. The public was stunned. A man who had preached morality, salvation, and divine guidance had betrayed the trust of countless followers in both personal and financial realms. Legal investigations revealed a complex web of deception. Bakker was charged with fraud, conspiracy, and tax evasion, alongside other financial crimes connected to the mismanagement of PTL donations and investment funds. During the trial, prosecutors outlined how the Bakker ministry had systematically diverted millions of dollars, exploiting the faith and trust of supporters nationwide. Witnesses testified to the lavish lifestyles funded by donations, the coercive practices used to extract money from followers, and the manipulation of both staff and congregants to maintain control over the empire. Bakker's conviction was dramatic and decisive. He was sentenced to 45 years in prison and ordered to pay millions in restitution. Though appeals and legal technicalities eventually reduced his sentence, his fall from grace was spectacular. From the pinnacle of televangelism and cultural influence to imprisonment, disgrace, and public infamy, the PTL network collapsed, and the empire he had built crumbled, leaving thousands of followers disillusioned and financially devastated. The aftermath of Bakker's crimes extended beyond legal consequences. The emotional, spiritual, and financial impact on his followers was profound. Families felt betrayed, some losing entire life savings, others struggling to reconcile their faith with the revelation that their spiritual leader had committed both moral and criminal violations. The broader evangelical community faced scrutiny, forced to confront the vulnerabilities inherent in centralized religious authority and media-driven ministry. Psychologists, sociologists, and clergy examined the psychological manipulation that allowed Bakker to wield influence, highlighting how charisma, media savvy, and spiritual authority can be exploited to devastating effect. Bakker's story also served as a cautionary tale for the intersection of faith and commerce. The blending of religious devotion with financial enterprise created a system ripe for exploitation, demonstrating the dangers of unchecked power and the vulnerability of congregants who place trust in leaders without accountability. The PTL scandal became a template for understanding how spiritual authority can mask criminal behavior, from financial fraud to sexual misconduct, and how communities can be manipulated by appearances of piety, benevolence, and charisma. Even decades after his conviction, Jim Bakker's legacy remains a polarizing topic. Some followers maintained their faith despite the betrayal, distinguishing between Bakker's personal failings and the teachings they valued. Others abandoned organized religion entirely, wary of leaders who could exploit devotion for personal gain. Media, scholars, and religious institutions continue to study the case as a landmark example of televangelist abuse, emphasizing lessons about oversight, transparency, and the ethical responsibilities of those in positions of trust. The story of Jim Bakker leaves a haunting reflection. Charisma, influence, and the guise of holiness can conceal betrayal, manipulation, and crime. His rise and fall demonstrate the destructive power of unchecked authority, the fragility of trust, and the long-lasting impact of exploitation on individuals, families, and communities. Bakker's actions remind us that faith, while a source of hope and guidance, can also be weaponized, and that vigilance, critical awareness, and accountability are essential to prevent the misuse of spiritual authority. In the end, the saga of Jim Bakker is more than a story of crime. It is a cautionary tale about human nature, institutional vulnerability, and the enduring consequences of betrayal. The millions who once looked to him for guidance were left to navigate the aftermath of deception, financial ruin, and shattered trust, serving as a stark reminder that evil can wear the mask of divinity, and that the line between faith and exploitation can be disturbingly thin. For more real-life crime stories, subscribe and stay tuned for the next deep dive.